Hi everybody, my name is Leah. Thank you so much for coming and watching this class. It's my favorite topic, making your own natural paints. I'm a painter myself. I'm an oil painter and a watercolor painter for many years, and also own a business called Natural Earth Paint. And we make eco-friendly and non-toxic and high-quality professional grade art supplies for fine artists and also children. So today we're going to learn about how to make your own natural watercolor paint and also natural gouache paint, which requires just one additional ingredient to the watercolor recipe, and also some natural inks. So yeah, for me, I was an oil painter most of my life, and I still am, but I've incorporated watercolor painting in the past 10 years or so, just as I was getting super busy with my business and had shorter spurts of time. And so I just really love the ease of watercolor paint and the quick setup, and also being able to make my own paints so that they're completely natural and non-toxic. And yeah, here's a few examples of my kind of style. I just love going out into the woods or on the creek and just painting a scene or some mosses or ferns or clovers. So just little quick watercolor sketches that just for the purpose of feeding my soul and just nourishing me, and it just improves my mental health so much. So I love watercolor painting. But one question a lot of people have is, why would I make my own watercolor paint when I can just buy the pans in the store or the tubes? And the answer to that is that for a few reasons. One is the toxicity. So generally watercolor is one of the less toxic art forms, but if you go to art supply stores these days, you'll actually notice that quite a few of the pans have carcinogenic and health hazard warnings on the label. So that's primarily because of the pigment used, heavy metal pigments or carcinogenic pigments. So that's definitely a bonus to mixing your own paint. You can just guarantee that it's completely natural and non-toxic, and you can make sure it's light, fast pigments. A lot of watercolor paints are fugitive so that they will fade over time. So you can make sure that if it's an earth pigment, for example, it's the most light, fast, and UV resistant paint on the planet. So you can just be guaranteed of the quality. Another reason to make your own paint is because of controlling the quality. So you can control the amount of pigment that you mix in. So it has a much higher pigment load than what you would buy in the store. You can make sure that there's no additives or fillers or bulking agents that have been put in the paint just to make more paint as a way for the manufacturer to make more money, basically. So you can make sure it's completely pure, just 3 ingredients: pigment, gum arabic, which is a tree sap, and honey. Or if not honey, then glycerin for a vegan version, which works just as well. So yeah, you have total control of the quality, the purity, the non-toxicity. And another reason is because of the affordability. So you can make so much paint for such a small amount of money by mixing it yourself. And we actually sell a make your own natural watercolor kit that has 10 earth and mineral pigments, totally light, fast, and non-toxic, professional grade, and the gum arabic and the watercolor pans and the mixing instructions and everything you would need to make your own watercolor paint. But you can also harvest your pigments in nature. You might have some pigments. These are a few of mine over here that you already have, and use gum arabic and a liquid honey or glycerin. So it's super easy. And to make gouache, you actually just add one additional ingredient, which is limestone powder. And we actually sell a natural impasto. It's called a natural impasto medium, but it's essentially artist grade limestone powder. And then you have gouache. So super, super easy. Also, the process of mixing your own paint is very peaceful and cathartic, and that also nourishes my soul. To mix paint, it just feels good. It's relaxing, and it's a wonderful process. So I think you guys will love it, and we're gonna now turn the camera down so you can look at my palette, and we'll start the mixing process. All right, so here we go. I have all of our supplies set out, and we can go through them first one by one just to tell you a little bit why we need each thing. So to start off, we need a surface to mix on. I prefer glass. So usually if you go to a glass shop, you could ask for a 1/4-inch piece of glass. We sell palettes, glass palettes too, but you can pretty much use any hard surface as long as it's not porous. So you wouldn't want to use a wooden palette or anything that would absorb liquid. So you could use granite or anything really hard, but I like glass just because you can put white paper underneath, and so it's a white clear surface. So we need that, a surface. Also a palette knife would be great. Most people have one around, but you can get them pretty cheap, and a bigger head like this is good for mixing, more of like a spatula type shape. And then an optional mixing tool is the glass muller. It's not absolutely necessary. You could just use the palette knife, but the reason the glass muller is good is because it ensures that every single pigment particle is coated in liquid. Because if any air pockets are in your paint, then it could cause cracking on your painting in the future. So the glass muller is just good for mixing larger amounts of paint, and also to just make it the most absolute, the most perfect mixing solution. So, and we also now sell a glass, small glass muller. Lots of watercolorists are using this just because when you mix watercolor paint, you generally don't need that much. You need like a couple tablespoons or maybe a couple teaspoons. So you don't need that much. So this is always an option. Although the benefit of the large one is that because of the heavy weight, you don't have to put any pressure. Like just the weight of the heavy glass muller is enough to mix the paint. So you don't have to put any weight at all. So that's the benefit of having a heavy, large one. All right, some people use a glass dropper to drop small amounts of liquid, but not necessary. And then for the ingredients themselves, so in the watercolor kit, we have 10 packets of earth and mineral pigments. So really radiant colors. It's not just earth tones, as a lot of people think that earth and mineral pigments are. So really bright colors. So you can either use these or you can use your own pigments or harvest your own pigments. There's instructions which we'll go through. And then gum arabic. So this is definitely an essential ingredient. And then we have the pans. So these are nice because they fit perfectly in any metal watercolor palette that you get at an art supply store or anywhere. They just pop right in. But you could use any receptacle. You could use seashells, any type of bottle caps, whatever you want to use to hold your watercolor paint. That's perfectly fine. All right, so besides those ingredients, the last thing you need is honey. So, and if you don't use honey, you could use glycerin if you're a vegan or just don't want to use it. And the purpose of honey is that it is a humectant and a plasticizer. So the humectant just means that it retains moisture in your paint after mixing. So it allows your dried paint pans to be re-wet, basically. If you didn't put in the honey, you wouldn't be able to re-wet the paint over and over. So it's also a natural preservative and a plasticizer. So it basically increases the flexibility of the gum arabic, because without it, the gum arabic would just be brittle. So you need this to make it flexible. All right, so I don't have any glycerin with me, but benefits of the glycerin are that it prevents cracking in your pan. So sometimes people use both. They use honey and glycerin if they want just a little bit of both effects. Also, glycerin can increase the flow of your paint a little bit, some people find. So it's up to you if you want to use both glycerin and honey or one or the other. And then again, the gum arabic is a tree sap from the acacia tree, and it's basically the glue that binds the pigment to your paper. So the last thing some people use is clove or thyme oil as a preservative, an antibacterial and antifungal agent. I don't have any right here, but basically just any essential oil, clove or thyme oil, and just a few drops. And that's mostly not necessary with the pans, because once they dry, they're good forever and they never go bad. But some people like to store their watercolor in liquid form. So if you do that, then maybe add some clove or thyme oil. All right, and then lastly, you need a tablespoon and a teaspoon, a glass jar, and some hot water. So that's about it. And some paper towels would be handy, or rags. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start mixing in real time, and you guys can check it out. All right, so we're gonna start with preparing the watercolor medium that we're gonna mix the pigment with. So to start out, we're gonna put 6 tablespoons of hot water into a glass. All right, next we're going to put in 3 tablespoons of gum arabic powder. And by the way, I'll give this recipe to you guys at the end. All right, and then you just give it a little stir with a spoon or whatever you have handy. And just mix until it is fully dissolved. Sometimes you'll see little chunks in there, and I usually just use the back of the spoon or the palette knife like this to just kind of squish them in so they're fully dissolved. You can also just put the lid on and give it a good shake so that you can make sure that it's really mixed in and dissolved before you add the honey. All right, looks good. All right, next I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of honey. So the honey is best to get a liquidy honey, not a hard honey, because it just makes it a whole lot easier to mix in if it's a liquid honey. And again, you can use glycerin instead, or both. Also, it's good to keep a track, maybe write notes on this jar and a little label of exactly how much honey or glycerin you added. Because say you mix up a batch of paint using this medium and your pans of paint crack, then you can notate to yourself, oh, I need to add a little bit more glycerin to my next batch. How much did I add to this batch? So, you know, this is a very flexible recipe. Lots of artists don't even measure. They kind of just estimate and pour in. So you can tweak it per color or per batch, depending on what you find out. And especially with pigments, because all pigments are completely different, you'll find, especially natural pigments. So they each have a totally different molecular structure, chemical composition. So, for example, Terre Verte, you might need to add double the amount of watercolor medium that you do with yellow ochre. So, all pigments absorb liquid differently. They mix differently with pigments. They have different drying rates. They're all just very, very different. So you kind of have to adapt and see what you like per color. But I'll give you a general recipe to go off of. All right, so this is the medium. And then at this point you would add in the drops of clove or thyme oil if you wanted to. So talking about affordability, this recipe, this amount of watercolor medium will make 20 to 25 full pans of paint. So yeah, talk about how cheap that is. And then this amount of pigment, say this is probably about $6 a pouch. 1 teaspoon of this will make 1 pan of pigment. And that pan of paint will last, as you know, a very long time. So it's very affordable. All right, so we're done with that. And now we're going to make the actual paint. So again, this medium you can store in your fridge for, I think I've stored it for over a year, maybe even a year and a half, and it did not go bad. So it lasts a very long time if you store it in the fridge. All right, so next we're going to mix 1 part medium with 1 part pigment. I think we'll use yellow ochre today. So again, as I was saying, every color absorbs liquid differently. So you can just see how it is when we mix it up and see if this is enough or we need more. So I'm gonna do 1 teaspoon. And wipe it out a little bit so it doesn't get into our medium. Then I'm going to make a little divot, kind of like a volcano, and I'm going to pour the medium in there. So like I said, 1 to 1, so I'm going to do 1 scoop of that and 1 scoop of this. All right, so now we do the mixing. So basically you're just scooching it inwards towards where you poured it, scooping it inwards to the middle of the circle, and then pushing down, smashing and pushing. Keep on pushing it into the center. All right, it already looks done, but as I was saying, you could just use the palette knife and not the muller, but if I wanted to be extra sure that it was mixed, I'd use the muller. Another thing, if you don't want to use the muller, is kind of replicate a muller action by pressing and swirling like that. So you can see the little tiny grains, so it is good that I'm doing that. All right, now that we've done this part, we will then try out the muller, which is so much fun. And this is the most kind of peaceful part. So we're gonna do kind of figure 8 motions like this. And as I said before, I'm not putting any downward pressure. I'm literally just moving it because the weight of the muller is doing just plenty of pressure. I'm not grinding the pigments down. They're already ground as fine as they're gonna go. And so all we're doing is coating the pigment particles with the medium. All right, so now I'm gonna do a little scrape. I'm gonna bring it back into the center again to get my little pile of paint in the center. And this is really ready. It looks smooth and good to me, but some people will do a couple more passes as swirling, mixing, and scraping into the center again. So it's completely up to you. I can feel that it's smooth and not grainy, just with the texture. So yeah, at this point, you can scrape your muller, and it usually just wipes off super easy. With a paper towel, you can give it a little rinse under some water and get all of the paint residue off. All right, so now we're going to put it into a pan. And it's just as simple as scooping and pouring. So some people who live in humid areas find that they like it better to fill it halfway like this and then let this dry overnight and then add the rest. So sometimes I might fill, like with this amount of paint, I'll just put this into this pan as well, let that dry overnight, and then tomorrow I'll mix more paint and then fill these trays. The reason for that is that if it takes a long time because you're in a humid area to dry, it could possibly mold. So just to prevent that, this is a way to do that. But if you live in a dry area, you can just fill it all the way up. Generally, when it dries, it shrinks too. So you can really fill it like almost overflowing because it will shrink and decrease in amount. All right, so you saw that this only took 1 teaspoon of pigment and it made 1 full pan. So, and this will last me years, frankly. All right, so then to clean, yeah, just paper towels and water, since this is all water soluble. One thing I really love to use is a scraper. You can get this from any hardware store, specifically the one with the razor blade. There's some other paint scrapers where it's more dull, but this is an actual razor blade paint scraper, and so that works best on the glass, I find. So that is just a super quick, easy way to clean. And again, take notes on each pan of paint you make, how much pigment you added, how much honey or glycerin, just so that if you want to tweak it next time, maybe you feel like, oh, I want it to be more opaque or more pigmented than this batch. So you can make another batch and tweak it to your liking. All right, so next we are going to make gouache. All right, so for gouache, it's pretty much the same process. So you're going to make the watercolor base in the exact same way. And then you're going to mix the pigment with the impasto medium, which is also just limestone powder. You can get this many different places. And then you're going to mix that into the watercolor base. So we're going to just do that here. All right, so I'll do green this time. Get some paper towels. All right, so I'll clean out my teaspoon. And I am going to measure 1 teaspoon of pigment. I could use a little shallow bowl, but this is all. Actually, maybe I'll use this. Well, no. All right, use this. Do 1 teaspoon of pigment. And then I'm going to do 1 teaspoon of the impasto medium, which is limestone powder. So for those who don't know, gouache is basically opaque watercolor. So lots of watercolor artists use some gouache with their watercolor painting, or some artists use just purely gouache for all their paintings. And it's a beautiful, opaque, creamy, water-based paint, and you can make it so easily and use it on paper, sketchbooking, canvas, pretty much any surface. All right, so we've mixed the pigment with the watercolor base. All right, so now I'm gonna just pour this out. Create the volcano hole. And then I will add the watercolor base. So since we know that this is 2 teaspoons of powder, we're going to add 2 teaspoons of base. So if I could have just scooped out 1 teaspoon of that mixture and then used 1 teaspoon of base, but either way is fine. So the limestone powder looks white, obviously, but once it's mixed with liquid, it disappears. It becomes clear. So you can see that it did look like a pale green, and now it's going back to a rich, opaque green because the whiteness just goes away. And then it's the exact same process as before. Mixing it as well as you can, and then adding in the muller. Right, this isn't completely clean, but I think it's good enough for this demonstration. You can hear the crackling of the pigment particles as it's smoothing out. And again, you can do little tiny circles within a large circle, or you can do more of a figure 8. So if you're doing gouache to store in liquid form, then you would probably want to make more paint so that you could put it into a little jar. I recommend keeping it in the fridge too, just to preserve it a little bit longer. Although you can also add the clove oil to keep it a little bit longer preserved. Scrape your muller and then bring that back to the center. All right, we have a lot of gouache opaque watercolor. Nice. So I think I'm just going to show what this looks like brushed on some watercolor paper real quick so you guys can see. All right. This is that great paper that's made with bamboo. We also have one that's made with sugarcane, and it's made by Hahnemühle. They have a really amazingly eco-friendly facility where they don't harm the environment at all in the making of this paper. All right, so let's just do a little bit of gouache. Yeah, you can see how opaque that is. Just a really nice, flowy, richly pigmented paint. So you can tell this definitely doesn't need any more pigment. It is very rich. All right. Yummy. All right, so now let's try the watercolor. I'll grab another brush. All right, so normally you would use a pan that was dried, but we don't have a dried pan right here, so I'm just going to use the liquid paint, which many people prefer liquid watercolors. It's just up to you. So I'll need to add a little bit more water. All right, so there is the yellow ochre. And I think I want more paint on my brush. Yeah, it's so rich. A while back I did a test where I got some professional grade tubed watercolor paints from the store and then made the exact same color with my own recipe and painted them side by side, and the homemade colors were so much more vibrant and luminous and radiant. It was just a complete convincing demonstration. One thing about earth and mineral pigments is that the reason they're so beautiful and radiant is because the pigment particles are irregular in size. They're not uniformly made like synthetic pigments. So when light hits these pigments, it bounces off in many different directions. So the paint has much more luminous quality to it. It's hard to describe unless you see it in person. But when light hits a synthetic pigmented paint, it hits the surface, bounces straight back out. So it's not as luminous, it's a little bit more flat. So that's one great quality. Also, I mentioned before that it has the highest light fastness of any pigment, the most UV resistant, the most humidity resistant, the most archival and durable. So it's pretty crazy that something totally eco-friendly and safe is also the highest quality. So that's what we're trying to promote with earth paint, is that knowledge that eco-friendly can also mean the highest quality. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I would love to hear any questions or comments you have about this process. And please reach out and let me know that if you have any questions about anything that I taught today. But it was super fun, and please let me know if you need anything. NaturalEarthPaint.com is our website, and we have a huge resources section with tons of recipes. So thanks again. It was great to be with you guys. Bye-bye.